Good morning, everyone. My name is Aaron Summerall. I'm the Director of Research, Education, Outreach for Brig Trap Systems. As we're getting all of the participants logged in and registered in today, we'll take a minute or two before we get the webinar kicked off. But while we're getting everybody positioned and in place, a couple of things I wanted to remind you of, bring your attention to. Next month, December the 12th, will be the next webinar that we'll host. That webinar is basically going to be for you to pose your questions, ask us anything that's come up that you see that is causing some head scratching, I guess. And so if you want to, then you can also submit the questions that you have ahead of that webinar. And to do that, what we want you to do is send those to marketing@pigbrig.com. I'll go over it again, this information again at the end of the webinar. But just trying to get everybody in position now. I'll go ahead and give you a heads up for the December webinar. And that will be back in our typical time that what we host monthly, 7 p.m. Central, 8 p.m. Eastern, 5 p.m. I guess on the West Coast. So what we're going to do today, though, we'll get kicked off here in probably another few seconds, minute or so, and turning this over to Dr. Jim Beasley. But what we wanted to do is ask you just a question really quickly. Is make sure that you know whenever to how to navigate and pose your questions if you have any for Dr. Beasley. On your screen, side of the screen, bottom, wherever it is on your device, there is a box there that has Q&A. So what we want you to do is submit those questions through that Q&A box. So to make sure that everyone knows that where that box is and how to put something in there, what I would like for you to do is tell me, just in whatever part of the world you're at, what weather conditions present the most difficult time for you whenever you're trying to catch your pigs. So what weather condition gives you challenges? So if you would put those in the Q&A, and that way we know that you're navigating through the platform here. But what we'll do is you're going through, we're gonna be again, pose questions as you see as they come through the presentation, and what we'll do at the end of the presentation, after Dr. Beasley wraps up the content covering part of it, we'll come back around and pose those questions to Dr. Beasley and get everything answered before we wrap up for the day. So again, to just put in there what weather condition presents the biggest challenges for you whenever you're out after pigs. So what we'll do now is we'll go ahead and get things kicked off. And so first things first is joining us today is Dr. Jim Beasley at the University of Georgia. And so it's a great privilege to have him here with his wealth of knowledge. And so Dr. Beasley is a Terrell Professor of Forestry and Natural Resources at the University of Georgia, where his research is focused on the management and conservation of wildlife. Jim is active in wildlife damage management issues across the globe, where his lab uses science-based approach to better understand the impacts of human activities on wildlife and mitigate human-wildlife conflicts. Much of his research is focused on the spatial ecology and population dynamics of wildlife, management of wild pigs, carnivore ecology and conservation, and human-wildlife interactions. He has published over 200 peer-reviewed papers and book chapters on these topics, as well as 2 books on invasive species management over his career. He currently serves on numerous advisory and scientific boards, including as the International Atomic Energy Agency's wildlife advisor to the Fukushima Prefecture in Japan in response to the 2011 nuclear accident. So with that, Dr. Beasley, I'm going to go ahead and turn this over to you, and we'll be watching that Q&A box.
All right, great. Thanks so much, Aaron, for that introduction, and thanks all of you for tuning in today. Also want to just thank Brig for inviting me here to talk. What I was asked to talk about was various aspects of environmental effects on pig movement. And so kind of before we get into the meat of that talk, I just wanted to orient us all to pigs and kind of set up the stage for kind of why we need to have better information on fine scale pig movements. So some of you have probably seen this figure before. What this represents is just illustrating the global distribution of pigs. And in black there, we've got the native range of Eurasian boar. And what I really want to point out here is that wild boar cover a huge diversity of environmental conditions. We have them in Scandinavia, up into parts of Russia, really cold environments, in temperate areas in Europe, down into more arid areas in northern Africa, and then down into tropical areas in Southeast Asia. So as a species, wild boar are incredibly, wide breadth in terms of the habitats that they occupy. But outside of their native range, people have been moving pigs all around the world. Particularly we think about European settlers as they moved around the world, bringing domestic pigs along with them as a food source. Those often were either intentionally released or got out, established feral populations on the landscape. And here in North America, at least in the US, this happened several centuries ago. But also in a lot of places, North America, South America, elsewhere, people have been moving around Eurasian boar for hunting purposes. In the case of Canada, this is for an alternative meat market. And so what ended up happening is as these feral populations began expanding on the landscape with the introduction of these wild boar, they began to breed together. And so today, in much of their introduced range, we have what we refer to as wild pigs. And one of the big challenges here is wild pigs in much of the range have varying levels of Eurasian boar and domestic genes. And so you have, this animal that we bred for maximum reproduction from the domestic side, which creates a lot of problems in terms of management. And then on the other side with Eurasian boar, we have this animal that's incredibly hardy, has evolved to adapt from Scandinavia down to Southeast Asia and Northern Africa. So it really has, all the elements of pigs that made them prolific breeders and really hardy are kind of present in a lot of our pig populations around the world. And so one of the other challenges that we face with pigs, partially stemming from their genetic composition, is they're some of the most extreme generalist species that we have. Here in the United States and North America and much of the rest of the world, they're most abundant and widespread large invasive species. That on the right there, you can see just the breadth of habitat that's potentially available for pigs. On the left, we've got Northern Australia. So there's a lot of places even that don't have pigs or haven't had pigs historically where pigs could potentially exist based on the habitat. In much of their invasive range, they also have very few predators. But one of the biggest challenges with them is their extreme plasticity in diet. So pigs are omnivores, but they do have a plant-based diet. Most all studies out there show that about 90% of their diet is comprised of plant material, but they eat a huge diversity of plants, dozens and dozens of families of plants, thousands of species of plants. They'll eat basically anything that they can put in their mouth. They will eat vertebrates, and they do target invertebrates, especially earthworms, and also target fungi as well in certain places. So, they can eat almost anything and they can live almost anywhere. And so this has created some real challenges when it comes to management, because these factors have facilitated this, rapid shift in population size and distribution, particularly over the last few decades. And so this shift that you can see here, here in the United States, this was partially driven by, human-induced translocations, people illegally moving pigs around the country for hunting purposes. That's happened in other parts of the world as well. But there's also been some natural range expansion due to changes in climate, changes in land use like agriculture. And this is a pattern that we're seeing in the native range of this species as well, where there are places where wild boar are becoming a bigger issue than they had in the past. And so this isn't isolated to the range in North America or the United States. We see the same pattern playing out in Canada. Just in the last couple of decades, pig populations are exploding in much of the world. And so as populations have increased, the scope of impacts has really escalated. And when we think about impacts, we often kind of are drawn to economic impacts, as humans. And of the economic impacts, the one that we really think about are agricultural damages. Pigs cause tremendous damages to agriculture, throughout much of their invasive and native range. But they also cause a whole host of other issues, property damage. Vehicle collisions are something that gets very little attention, but there's a growing issue with pig vehicle collisions, throughout their invasive range. But really the ticking time bomb with pigs are foreign animal diseases. And we're fortunate, at least here in the US, that we don't have African swine fever, classical swine fever, foot and mouth, those kinds of things. But other parts of the world are dealing with these devastating diseases. And when they are introduced into an area, have really catastrophic consequences for domestic swine industry. And so there's a lot of effort out there trying to prevent the introduction of these diseases, or in countries that do have them, really scaling up management to deal with the downstream consequences of it. But pigs also cause a lot of ecological issues. And this is something that's far less studied. It gets a lot less attention. We do know that pigs opportunistically consume eggs from ground nesting songbirds. They consume sea turtle eggs. They compete with native species for high value food resources like acorns. But they also cause really extensive damages to wetlands or other sensitive ecosystems through rooting behavior or wallowing. And so this causes, can lead to erosion. It could introduce E. coli into systems, but it also can disrupt kind of that microhabitat conditions that a lot of amphibians and reptiles need. And so these are potentially pretty substantial consequences of pigs that have received far less attention. And so as populations have been increasing, we've seen a really radical shift in management here in the US, but also more broadly across the globe. Here, in the US, where I'm based, really it wasn't until the mid 2010s that people started to get really serious about scaling up pig management. And one of the catalysts for this was the establishment of the National Feral Swine Damage Management Program by Congress, who allocated some funding for this, which is a program many of you may know is managed by APHIS. And so there's been this infusion of resources out there on the landscape to remove pigs, but not just from a federal agency or even state agency perspective. There's been a huge growth in the private sector in terms of people actively going out and removing pigs, whether it's contract based or whether it's people developing new types of traps or new products to facilitate trapping. There's been tremendous growth there, but also on the private side, individual landowners are becoming more actively engaged in pig management. Land managers for properties are becoming more actively and seriously engaged in pig management. So there's a lot more people, that are interested in these types of things right now than there were even a decade ago. But one of the big challenges is, whether it's at a local level or whether it's across a big agency, is that there's just not enough resources to go around. And so most pig management across the country, across the globe, is reactive and temporary. We all know the squeaky wheel gets the grease, and that's often how pig management plays out at various spatial and temporal scales. We just can't be everywhere at the same time. And so, really, we need to think about how to maximize the resources that we have to have the most maximal impact. And that's what some of the things I'll talk about will hopefully help improve some of those decisions. And the reason that's important to think this way is because there's been very few studies on this, but the few that have been done have shown that when you walk away from intensive management, pig populations can recover in just a matter of months. Within 4 to 6 months, certainly within a year, your population is almost always right back to where it was before. And so when you have these gaps in management, it's really difficult to have long-term success. So we need to be strategic in how we allocate those resources. And one of the other big challenges is remarkably, there's surprisingly little research been done on wild pigs. This is one of the things that I found just staggering when I started working on pigs 10 or 15 years ago or so. Most emphasis has been on removal, and research just really isn't prioritized. They're not, most state agencies don't fund pig research, and this is a limitation because it hinders our ability to improve management if we don't have the science to back it up. Now, things have changed over the last decade. There's a lot more researchers around the world who are doing really good pig research, but for a long time, we've been way behind the curve compared to species like white-tailed deer or elk or even bighorn sheep, a lot of the other animals that are heavily pursued or hunted or invasive species. And so in terms of movement and what we know about movement, one of the most striking things about pigs is their ability to adapt to different systems. But we do know that they are water limited. They're poor thermal regulators. And so kind of a consistent theme, and I'll touch on this later on, is that if you have water, that's a good indication that pigs can survive in that area. And so over the last decade or so, there's been a growing number of researchers and managers who are throwing radio collars out on the landscape to use the data from those collars to improve management or better understand the ecology of this species. But one of the challenges is most of those studies have just simply looked at home range sizes, resource selection, but not actually digging into the fundamental drivers of what's making those home ranges larger or smaller, what habitat conditions, what environmental factors, how the distribution of resources on the landscape influences movement, how weather influences movement. And these, I would advocate that these are the types of things that feed more directly into management programs than just knowing general home range sizes. That's useful information, but I think we need to dig a little bit deeper to really have an impact on management. And so that's what I wanted to touch on, through the rest of the talk today, is kind of the state of knowledge of where we are in terms of drivers of pig movement. Again, like I mentioned a minute ago, pigs are severely understudied. And so a lot of these are not topics that have, dozens of extensive studies. A lot of what I'm going to talk about, I'm drawing from just a handful of studies. But kind of, initially, I want to talk a little bit about drivers of core scale movements, kind of at a landscape level, kind of things like home range size, shape, kind of, landscape level factors. But then at the end, I want to really dig into how some fine scale investigation of activity or behavioral based resource selection influences movements, how weather influences movements, and kind of where we are, the state of knowledge on that. And then, touch on a couple of other things that we've been looking at in my lab as well, like physiology and diet and the effects of bait on pig movements. So to start off at kind of like a 30,000 foot view scale of the effects of landscape on pig movements, this is some work that was kind of pooled together in a paper several years ago, where a number of folks from around the US kind of pool GPS data to try and look at landscape level drivers of pig movement. And, I don't want to dig into all the nuances of the data, but kind of the general theme that came out of this paper was that places that are drier or have more dispersed water, pigs tend to have larger home ranges. If you're in productive bottomland systems or have extensive stream networks of things of that nature, pigs tend to have much tighter home ranges. So just knowing something about the landscape can tell you how far pigs are moving in that area, even if you've never stepped foot in that landscape. We also see a negative relationship with density. And, this is pretty intuitive. It's a similar finding that we find with a lot of other species. You can see this figure is being driven by some of these outliers, these really high densities. Those are, really incredible densities of pigs that are driving the distribution of that graph. But it's not necessarily density itself that's driving these reduced home ranges. Density is also a product of habitat. Where you have better habitat, you have higher density. So whether it's density or habitat that's driving it, I think needs to be teased out. But either way, when you have more pigs in an area, they tend to move less than if you have less pigs. But most people aren't thinking about things at this broad scale. So kind of narrowing in a little bit, within a given landscape, what are the drivers of home range size? And so any of you out there who have collared pigs or ear tag pigs, know that within a given system there's incredible variability among individuals, sometimes orders of magnitude difference in home range size among individuals living in the same landscape. And so what is driving that? That's kind of a burning question we have when looking at these data in my lab. And so one of the things that explains a lot of the variance that we see is simply sex. Males move around much more on the landscape than females. You can see here, these are two data sets on the bottom that we're actively collecting at the moment. And you can see, males generally have home ranges that are at least 2, often 3 or 4 times larger than females. And this makes sense biologically. As a species, females tend to form these social groups, which we refer to as sounders, and those sounders have some level of territoriality, some kind of loose territorial boundaries, across most of the studies that have looked at that. And so females are somewhat confined spatially by the distribution of other females on the landscape or other social groups, whereas males are often, because of their reproductive ecology, males are moving around more, they're solitary, sampling more or integrating with more, with multiple sounders on the landscape. And so they're having to move much further to meet their reproductive needs. So sex alone accounts for a lot of the variability in home range size. But habitat seems to as well. These are some weekly home ranges that we generated. This is from these data are from South Carolina. You can see males and females. And again, this is a weekly home range, and you can see this pretty strong negative relationship between home range size and the proportion of bottomland hardwoods. So for those of you who may not be familiar with the southeastern United States, bottomland hardwoods are, hardwoods often have mass trees in them. There's kind of intermittent flooding. There's a lot of water present in these systems. They're often near streams or other kind of water bodies. And so these are just productive habitats for a lot of different reasons for pigs. And we can see that the more of this high quality habitat that pigs have in, available to them, the smaller their home ranges are. And you can see how small those female home ranges get in areas that have 80% or more bottomland hardwoods. So, knowing something about the productivity of your habitat and the habitats that are available, just knowing that alone can give you some kind of perspective on how far pigs in your landscape are likely moving. And so in this system where these data were collected, this is kind of what that looks like, where you've got, these kind of dark green areas are these bottomland hardwoods, again, flanking the stream systems, whereas that light green represents upland pines. These are less productive systems, at least for wild pigs. And what pigs tend to do is concentrate a lot of their movement along these stream corridors. And, in much of the range, particularly in the southeastern U.S., pigs are found throughout almost every county in a state, but they're not everywhere in every county. They're predominantly constrained to these river drainages. So, again, those of you who trap pigs know this all too well. But just understanding the level of complexity of the habitat can give you an indication of how far those pigs are moving. And also food availability. This is something that's received, not enough attention. There's not a lot of work that's been done on this. Some work done a few decades ago, but we know that when there's big mast years of acorns, pigs are reducing their movements, focusing their movements around those high productive, high calorie food resources. There's been a little bit of work done with agriculture, and as you might expect, Pigs that are close to agricultural fields tend to have smaller home ranges, whereas pigs that are further from agriculture tend to have larger home ranges. That makes intuitive sense. Pigs are really driven by their stomachs, especially females. And so if you're in a high productive agricultural area that's flanked by bottomland hardwoods or some other high quality area with water, your pigs in those areas are going to have much smaller home ranges than if they have to travel to get to agriculture or other high quality food resources. But how about home range shape? And so home range shape is important to think about because it gives you some kind of an indication of kind of how you need to concentrate your management activities. Should you focus simply around streams or riparian areas, or can you branch out into some of the more upland habitats? That's really context dependent. But of all the individuals that we've looked at, we quantify this, refer to it as a shape index parameter, or a value closer to 1 means a more circular home range. A value that's larger represents a more linear home range, like the shape of a pencil. For pigs, across all the ones that we've looked at so far, they generally tend to have more circular home ranges. So they're kind of, some of those ones on the far right, that pink one on this figure here is kind of more your typical pig home range. However, what we've found is that in systems where there's a lot of heterogeneity in habitat types, like this one here that I've got on the screen, where you've got these bottomland habitats kind of flanked by these upland pines. Pigs in areas where streams are flanked by upland pines tend to have very linear home ranges. So think back to that figure I showed just on the last slide. These pigs their movements are largely confined to that drainage basin, that bottomland habitat. They're really not venturing too far into those uplands, especially the females. Males tend to move a little bit more, again, looking for those breeding opportunities. However, when you have streams that are surrounded by bottomland hardwoods, in those cases, pigs tend to have more circular home ranges. So really need to think about where your water is and what the habitats around that water look like, to have an indication of some insights into how those pigs are likely using your landscape. Okay, so now I want to shift a little bit and start getting into some of the more fine scale movement behavior. And most all pig studies that have been done have kind of looked at resource selection at a really coarse scale. So just taking GPS locations and trying to look at how pigs are moving on the landscape. I would advocate that we need to start breaking that down a little bit better. The data that we get from GPS collars today is just a treasure trove of information that we can mine to better understand animals. And looking at behavioral states is one way that we can do that, through these behavioral state analyses. And what I mean by that is we can take 2 consecutive GPS points and look at the distance between those points and what the angle is between 3 or more points. And when an animal is resting, you would imagine that those distances between points is going to be very short. It shouldn't be anything more than GPS error, basically. And those points should have really tight turning angles because the animal is just basically sedentary. When an animal like a pig is foraging, any of you have watched pigs forage on the landscape, they just kind of meander around in an area, just kind of rooting up the landscape. And so we'd expect slightly longer step lengths than when they're resting, but also these, still these tight turn angles. They're moving in circles back and forth. But when an animal is traveling, we've got long step lengths and shallow turning angles. And so we can use hidden Markov movement models or other types of analytical approaches to try and take all this great information that we're getting and distill it down into these different behaviors. And I think by going this way, we start to learn more about the ecology of this animal that can improve management. And one of the ways we've done that is to look at activity patterns. And so on the left, we have females in 2 different seasons. Low forage basically is winter, high forage is spring, summer, and into the fall when there's acorns. And we got females on the left, males on the right. And one of the things that jumps off the page when you look at this is that females and males move differently. From the times that I've been out hunting pigs, this is not something that I necessarily would have keyed in on, but we see it really clearly from the data. Males are traveling at night, almost exclusively at night. During the day, they're pretty much just resting, whereas females, their movement peaks right before dusk, and then it kind of starts to taper down throughout the early phases of the night. And the rest of the day, they're kind of the rest of the early morning hours through mid to late afternoon, they're kind of similarly resting, foraging, and traveling. And so knowing this, you can target your management for especially things like shooting for females and males perhaps slightly differently. But we can also dig into resource selection patterns of pigs. And there's a lot of information here. I'm not going to go through it all, but just hit some of the high points. And so basically with this figure, what we did is break down all those GPS points into whether they're resting, moving, traveling, or foraging, and looked at how they were selecting resources on the landscape during these different behaviors. And a couple things jump out. Distance to bottomland hardwoods and percent canopy cover, males and females seem to be doing similar things. They're selecting for areas close to bottomland hardwoods across all these behavioral states, and they're both selecting for areas with greater canopy cover. Makes sense. Pigs don't like to be out in the open that long. That leaves them vulnerable. So this is some consistent evidence between sexes, but we also see some more nuanced and complex things when we break down these different behaviors. And these things are masked when we just pool all these data together. Kind of starting at the top there, distance to upland pines, we see that males, regardless of behavior, tend to be selecting for areas away from upland pines, whereas females have a less strong pattern there, except during that traveling phase. Distance to upland hardwoods, some slight differences between males and females. Males tending to rest close to upland hardwoods, females foraging a little bit away from them. Distance to shrublands. We've got females, when they're resting, tend to rest in or closer to these thick shrubby areas, but when they're foraging or traveling, they're moving away from those thick, dense areas, whereas males tend to mostly be in these thicker areas. And then finally, distance to roads. You can see some differences between males and females there based on behavioral state. So kind of armed with this information, we can then take this and apply it from whatever management perspective we're thinking about in a more fine resolution than just pooling all these data together. So now I want to dig into weather a little bit. And there's not been a lot of studies on what effects of weather on wild pigs, but there have been a few. Just so we're all on the same page, kind of when you have low pressure, so we'll start with barometric pressure. When you have low barometric pressure, you can think of this as kind of more stormy or rainy days. And when you have high pressure, that's these bright sunny days, these really nice conditions. And so this will become relevant over the next few slides. And so, surprisingly, there's studies on pressure for a lot of species, but this is not, something that's extensively worked on. But we do know that wild turkeys, for example, increase their gobbling when barometric pressure is rising. And for those of you who are turkey hunters, this probably makes a lot of intuitive sense. When you're out there on a really crummy day, the birds just aren't gobbling, but on a, after a storm passes and you got a nice clear day, tend to hear more gobbling. Coyotes seem to increase the response to calling during changing barometric pressure, whether it's increasing or decreasing. And one that makes a lot of sense is birds, when they depart for migration, are more likely to do so at nights when the pressure is increasing. So when you're moving, away from a storm event and into better weather, birds are starting to move on migration. Again, that makes a lot of sense. That's when you'd want to move if you're a bird when weather's improving. But what do we know about pigs? The little bit that has been done on pigs suggests that pigs respond to pressure across a whole range of different temporal scales. And I'll kind of walk through a couple of those right now. So in terms of the maximum daily distance that a pig moves, one of the really interesting things we see when we look at data on pig movements is that we see this concave relationship. So when there's low pressure, during storms, pigs are reducing the maximum daily distance move. This makes sense. They're hunkering down during really bad weather. But surprisingly, they're also moving a lot less when pressure is really high. And so during those bright sunny days, for example, pigs tend to move less. So there seems to be this sweet spot for optimal conditions for wild pig movement. And so, pressure is something that we can easily look up with all the great meteorological tools that we have available to us. And so this suggests that there's a sweet spot of pressure conditions where pigs are moving more than other instances. At a home range scale, though, something a little bit different. Keep in mind that figure I just showed, that's why I left it up there. And we look at weekly home ranges of pigs. We actually see an increasing trend with home range and with core area. And this actually mirrors a lot of that figure up above, until you get to that downturn on those really high pressure days. And basically what this suggests is that pigs are covering much less of their home range during bad weather events. When you have, moving into better weather, higher pressure, pigs are covering more of their home range. And just something overall that I'll mention that we've looked at. Pigs in general on a weekly scale cover at least half to 2/3 of their overall kind of annual home range. So pigs actually, much like a wolf or a coyote, are moving around a lot within their home range. They're not just kind of isolated in one area for a week and then moving somewhere else for a week. They're covering a good bit of territory from week to week. And this suggests that weather does play an influence on how much of their home range that they're covering. But when you zoom out at a monthly scale, and so this is the average pressure over a month, we lose that concave relationship when we see this negative declining relationship with pressure. And so we have more movements during months with low pressure than really high pressure. And I think what this ultimately reflects are seasonal differences. I don't think, pigs aren't thinking about things at a monthly scale. We as people might think that way, but pigs are more operating at that daily or even hourly scale. And so this suggests that during months that are nicer weather, so probably more summer months and things of that nature, pigs tend to be moving less than during months where there's a lot more rain or storm activity. And so how about temperature? So temperature is another thing that we can easily measure on a day-to-day or hour-to-hour basis. And again, there's not a ton of work done on this, but what work has been done shows something very similar as pressure across all the different temporal scales that you look at. So at a daily scale, if you remember back to that pressure figure, it looks almost identical to this, where pigs are reducing their movements during really cold temperatures and really high temperatures. And there seems to be this kind of sweet spot of pig activity in the middle there, with kind of mid-range temperatures. Again, at the monthly scale, just like with pressure, we see this negative linear relationship. Again, this is reflecting seasonal differences. So in those warm summer months, pigs are just moving a lot less than they are in the colder months. And, again, getting back to what I talked about before in terms of their thermal regulation abilities, it makes sense that pigs are not going to be, roaming around the landscape as much when it's really hot. And then that weekly home range size, again, these are looking at the weekly movements of pigs on the landscape, and we see in general, a similar pattern that I just showed with the maximum temperatures. When it's warmer out, pigs are just moving less. They're having smaller home ranges on the landscape, and you can see it's a slightly stronger relationship for males. They're on the top there than for females. Their home ranges are cut by almost half, in these warmer months compared to the winter months. And so just throwing these two things up there together, on the left, we've got pressure. On the right, we have maximum temperature. And then on the top is the daily scale, and the bottom is the monthly scale. And so you can see that when you go from the daily to the monthly scale, the inferences that you derive from that are quite different. We're missing a lot of information at that monthly scale that we're picking up at that daily scale. So scale matters, and I'll touch on this at the end. But where this becomes relevant is kind of what are the management goals? At what temporal scale is the management occurring at? Are you thinking about things on a month-to-month or seasonal basis? If so, those bottom figures are probably more relevant to your management decisions. Whereas if you're thinking about things from a more daily perspective, whether it's shooting or helicopter work, that's where looking at these more fine scale figures becomes important. So it all comes back to what scale is your management taking place. And so, we work on a lot of different aspects of pig ecology in my lab. So I wanted to throw in a couple others here that I thought were relevant because they speak to other ways that pig movement can be affected. So in their invasive range, in areas where there's favorable habitat, others have found that pigs are pregnant throughout the year. So this figure on the top right here, these are some data that we collected in South Carolina. And you can see that in any given month, between 15 and 50% of the females on the landscape are pregnant. And those that aren't pregnant often have newborn piglets with them. And so these are just baby factories, churning out litter after litter. They have multiple litters in a year. And so this is really important when we think about pig management for a number of reasons, because reproduction in a species like pigs does or should influence their movement behavior, their social dynamics, all those different things that come into play when we're trapping or shooting pigs. And so we did a study a couple of years ago where we actually radio collared a large number of sows, and we put vaginal transmitters in them so we could document exactly when they gave birth. We went in and did some survivorship studies with the piglets. What I want to talk about here is how reproduction affects pig movements. And so if you look at that figure on the left, that black bar represents farrowing, so when that pig is giving birth. And you can see in that 95% home range, that black line that kind of goes throughout kind of horizontally across that figure, that's the home range size changing from day to day. And you see this sharp decline, right when she farrows, which makes sense. She's tied to the natal nest at that point. And so her movements pretty much drop to nothing for 1 to 2 weeks, after which we see a spike, probably going out there trying to pack on as many nutrients as she can, and then a slow increase in movements after that. That lasts a considerable amount of time, but there's at least a few week period where her movements are drastically reduced. And you can see that on that right hand figure. Those home ranges are just a fraction of what they are even right before birth and right after birth during that farrowing period. So knowing something about what reproductive state your pigs are in can play a role in how you cater your management at that time. And we also know, I don't think there's a lot of good research out there that's looked at this, but just anecdotally, just from trapping, you realize that when sows give birth, they're isolating themselves from the sounder in a lot of cases, sometimes for a week or two, sometimes for longer periods than that. And so as these births are happening, throughout the year, that composition of sounders that you're trying to trap is constantly being disrupted by these reproductive events. And so kind of having a better understanding of how reproduction drives both composition and movements can help kind of prioritize or deprioritize targeting certain sounders. This is something that's not been looked at extensively in males, but I would guess that, when a number of sows are coming into estrus, throughout the landscape, because there are some peaks in births, and you would expect that to have a pretty substantial increase in how much males are roaming around the landscape. But I don't think that's been extensively studied yet. Diet is another thing we've started to look at. This is a much more difficult thing to look at a really fine scale with pigs because they eat almost anything. But just real quick on the right here, these are some data we collected. These are genetic metabarcoding data. So we're able to actually use genetics to delineate what pigs are eating. So a much better resolution than just sifting through stomachs. And what we see, come out really clearly is no differences between males and females, but strong seasonal differences. And this is, of course, what you'd expect. There's different foods available different times of year, but pigs are shifting their diet based on what's available. One of the places we see this really clearly is this is an island study we're doing on the left, and or a coastal study, and pigs are moving, they're shifting their movement onto beaches during the spring and summer, focusing their consumption on crabs. So, depending on, you pick your landscape, and figure out what pigs are likely eating in that area, sifting through stomachs or whatever. Food drives where pigs are moving on the landscape, especially female. So understanding what their diet is can really help you improve, kind of that targeted approach to management. And so this is a really interesting figure, so I wanted to throw it up here. These are those plant data for one of the studies that we've done, and has a bunch of different categories of foods that we've lumped these genetic data into. And just to give you an idea of how much their diet changes from month to month. And a couple things just to highlight, hard mass, October here in the southeastern US, this is when acorns start raining down like manna from heaven. And so pigs are obviously, drawn into that resource, and they're continuing to eat those acorns throughout November, December, January, February, until those acorns are largely depleted. We see a spike here in July, and that's maintained in August and September. What I think this represents is pigs consuming the young seedlings of oaks or other things. It's not that there's this bumper of acorns that's fallen on the ground then. I suspect that it's consuming other parts, whether it's roots or leaves or stems of oaks during this time. November through February, we see a lot of consumption of conifers, actually. This is something that I'm interested to dig into a little bit more, but these are the months when there's very little kind of above ground green vegetation for pigs to eat. And so what I suspect that this is incidental consumption of pine needles that are laying on the ground that pigs are rooting up as they're looking for invertebrates or tubers or roots or things of that nature. During March and April, we see this spike, especially in March, of wetland plant consumption. And then April through September, we see a lot of consumption of grass, woody vines, soft mass, and shrubs. So, again, those of you who know pigs and work with pigs, this all makes very intuitive sense, but just wanted to illustrate, how variable a pig's diet is from month to month based on what's available. And so one of the things we're doing right now, this is an ongoing study, is trying to figure out what factors drive pig detection of bait sites. Can we optimize our placement of baits on the landscape based on these things that I've been talking about today, based on what we know about pig behavior. And so one of the things that we've uncovered so far, and again makes intuitive sense, is that if you put a bait pile even within the 70% isopleth of their home range, so basically this is covers the majority of their home range, 2/3, 3/4 of their home range. As long as a bait pile's within there, pigs are more likely to find it. But if you put it near the periphery of their home range, they're less likely to find it, and they're going to take a long time before they find it. Again, that makes sense. But one of the things we found, that distance to water makes a huge difference in how quickly, whether or not pigs find bait, and how quickly they find it. The closer you can put your bait to riparian areas, the greater the chance that pigs are going to find it, and they're going to find it quickly. And not only that, they seem to find bait much more frequently when there's greater density of understory. Like in this picture here in the background there, that's what a lot of our bottomland habitat looks like. It's really thick, really dense. Pigs just like those areas. There's water, there's cover, they feel safe in there. So the closer we're putting bait to this cover and near water, the more likely pigs are going to find that bait, and the quicker they're going to find it. So we can, shift some of our baiting strategies in these areas where we haven't worked before, to maximize our detection of pigs. So just real quick, a couple of takeaways to kind of summarize all this. We tend to think of pigs as these kind of exemplary generalist species. They can eat almost anything. They can survive almost anywhere in the world. But as hopefully I've demonstrated, there are a few key both biotic and abiotic factors that do drive pig movements. Even though they can survive almost anywhere, it doesn't mean that their movement behavior or other behaviors aren't modified depending on locally available conditions. And so, when you have high quality habitat or high pig density or a lot of water, those are all things that are going to reduce the movement of pigs in your landscape. When females are giving birth, that's going to change that sounder composition, decrease their movement. And then food is something I think we need some further study on, but the more dispersed food is around the landscape, the more pigs are going to move, the larger the home ranges, the greater the movement lengths, and things like that. The abiotic factors, this is where things get a little bit more complicated. In general, pigs tend to have smaller home ranges, less movement when there's greater temperature and greater pressure, and this generally reflects seasonal differences, but scale matters, because when you look at that fine scale on a daily basis, how pigs are moving on the landscape, they're actually moving differently at the temperature extremes and the pressure extremes. They're moving less during the extremes than they are in those intermediate temperatures and pressures. And so from a management perspective, most management of pigs is at a much finer temporal scale than we tend to think of a lot of research questions anyways. Whether it's trapping or shooting or flying helicopters, those decisions are often being made on a daily basis, or a nightly basis, or on a week-to-week basis. And so we need to have more fine scale information. And so considering, if you're operating at that scale, taking a look at what the forecast is can give you some insights on how much pigs are going to be moving. Think about shifts in resources that are happening, as crops are coming available, down the road, neighbors farms, is that corn coming in, those kind of things. That's all gonna have an impact on how pigs are moving. But kind of taking these kind of things into account, they're all subtle things, but the more we can arm ourselves with this kind of information, the more we can not only increase our success, but reduce our costs, which will allow us to spread our resources more broadly. And the other thing a lot of this information can do is allow us to infer some movement patterns of pigs in areas that we haven't worked before. We all go to new properties and start trapping there, kind of have spend several weeks, several months kind of learning the lay of the land of how pigs are operating there. And with some of this information, we can have some pretty good predictions of how pigs are likely to move on the landscape based on a few key factors like key wetland habitats, water, pine distribution, those kind of things, and also understory cover. A lot of the different studies that we're doing at the moment all seem to point to the fact that understory is really important for pigs, particularly from a cover standpoint. But these diverse, dense understories also provide a lot of forage for pigs. So that's all that I have today. There's a lot of folks that I work with on all these different studies, especially USDA and the National Wildlife Research Center. They've been great supporters of pig research, and the national program in general has been a great supporter of pig management and pig research throughout the U.S. And if we have a little time, I'll gladly take questions, or you can feel free to email me separately offline, and I'll do my best to get a hold of you and respond the best I can.
Thank you, Dr. Beasley. I do have one here that did come in earlier in the presentation, and it was the question reads is, how would you rank the importance of the following factors: weather, bait type or allure type, trap type, time of year, the trap or bait location? And he said they recognize that all play a role, but what do you find is most important?
Yeah, I'll try to think through those. And we've done some other work that touches on a lot of those that I didn't talk about today. We've got, I think we're into our third study right now looking at dozens of different lures and different bait types on the landscape. And every single one of those studies has suggested that lures can do more harm than good sometimes. We're actually seeing pigs avoid novel lures, even if they're things that we know attract pigs. Bait is far more important than lure. We are seeing, though, that when you combine lures with bait, that can have kind of a positive effect. So I would advise against using lures alone, but use bait. But with all those studies, we've also been factoring in where on the landscape we put those, and it all seems to come back to location. No matter what we put out there on the landscape, if it's not under their nose, they're either not going to find it, or it's going to take them a while to find it. So kind of like real estate, it's location, 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 and having bait that your pigs are familiar with and use, regardless of, that can differ depending on where you are in the country or the world. People use different baits. Speaking to trap type, we have a study that we've done that shows that trap type is really not that important. It is important in a lot of perspectives, but traps in general, if you're using a whole sounder based trap, you're going to be far more effective than using small traps that are not that are catching individual pigs. It's more about where you put that trap and knowing the behavior of those pigs in that landscape, and getting that trap put under the nose is going to be most important. Season is really important too. Any of you who trap know that if you're trying, like right now, we're trying to catch pigs, acorns are raining down all around us, or, it's more difficult. We're still able to catch them, but, waiting a couple more months, we're going to have far more success. So I would say it's more important to focus on where pigs are than the latest gimmick of lure or something like that.
I think a critical component too is just being patient. Those animals didn't have a calendar or a watch, so they're going to respond in their time. So I think trying to be too hasty in a management approach is going to cause more harm than good over time.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And right now, we're the pigs we're collaring at the moment. This is for a research purpose, not for management. We're actually doing some helicopter work with them, but we're just having to be far more patient than other times of the year, waiting for that entire sounder to get in that trap. It's just taken us a little bit longer. And so we're fortunate we have the luxury of time, but yeah, like you said, being patient, and sometimes the year may need to be more patient than others.
Yeah, we have another question that come in here too, and Dr. Beasley, some of this is I think definitely work that we've worked on together. As far as, have you found anything that works to deter deer or bears from traps or bait? The same for raccoons and squirrels. So
Yeah, that's a good question. You could probably answer that almost as well as I can. But yeah, we've been uh, looking at a couple of different deterrents for bait. And yeah, an optimal deterrent would not deter pigs, but deter deer, turkeys, raccoons, things that just consume all of your bait. We're still kind of working through some of the analyses there, but in general, there's a couple things out there. Some capsaicin. There's some things like that do seem to be effective at reducing deer consumption of bait. Raccoons are a little tougher than some other animals. That just speaks to the generous nature of raccoons. But capsaicin, I think the liquid fence worked reasonably well. So there should be, just stay tuned in the next few months. There should be some information coming out on that. And I think if anyone is going to the Seattle meeting, I think Caitlin in my lab is going to be presenting on some of that work. So if you're there, you can check that out. If not, you can kind of reach out in a few months, and we should have some more concrete stuff on that, because that would be really useful if there's something available that can reduce non-target consumption.
right. One of the things that you made reference to the capsaicin, and for any of you that are there that are interested, if you get in touch with us, we can send you the guide on what we've looked at with the capsaicin and how the mixtures are, and the application of that capsaicin project or product. And then also like the like what Dr. Beasley said is with the liquid fence, that's readily available at hardware stores, at Tractor Supply, things of that nature, and works relatively well on the deer. Um, the other thing that what I do sometimes if I just have unbelievably high densities on there is I'll use like 2 foot by 2 foot pieces of plywood and lay it over the top of the bait. And whenever, if pigs smell the bait, know the bait's under there, they're going to flip the plywood over, get to that bait. But it slows it down a lot for the deer, the raccoons as well. I know, talking to some of the other trappers around the world, is that they'll use downfall, just trees, limbs, branches, things like that, and cover the bait. And the pigs are not deterred by that, but seems that the deer, the elk, other animals are less willing to paw their way through that to be able to forage. So other things, thoughts about the squirrels. We do have some questions come in relative to squirrels certain times of the year. One is that, I mean, just if you can bait closer to dark before those just giving less time for those squirrels to get to your bait. They'll be going and denning up at night. So bait timing, I think, is going to be pretty critical. And then the consistency of when you put that bait out. If you're pretty regimented and consistently baiting at the same time each day, those pigs during that conditioning phase will acclimate a lot to your behavior, and many times shorten the duration between when you leave and when they show up. So quite a few different things that's out there, but excellent questions. These are some of the things that what we could talk about even more in detail in December. Next question that comes in too, it says, is there any research looking at how deer baiting influences the movement and ultimately trapping success? How do we get agencies or land managers to recognize the impacts?
There may be some research. I'm not all that familiar with it, but that is a tremendous challenge. I mean, people are dumping bait on the ground all over, certain states, certain parts of the world, and that, has implications from a movement perspective, but it also has implications in terms of, feeding pigs high quality food, helping them achieve their reproductive maximums, the more nutrition that pigs are getting, the bigger their litters are going to be. One of the things that we found is that larger sows have larger litters. And so if agencies or other people are putting food on the ground for pigs, for deer, or pigs are eating it, that could have some downstream consequences on pig populations as well. So again, I don't know. I know there's been a little bit of work. I think a study was just published that looked at kind of pigs taking over deer bait piles when pigs get on them, but I'm not familiar with other work related to that.
I want to hear there's a more, I guess, more of a statement is it says here in Hawaii, barometric pressure changes drastically throughout the day, from day to day. Trying to think of how we can use the information presented seems to suggest we need traps closer together and be more patient with the pigs finding the traps.
Yeah, that's a real challenge when you live. I mean, places like Florida too have rapidly fluctuating pressure with storms coming in daily and things like that. Yeah, so at that kind of scale, I would think that those kind of changes might just reflect, real fine scale shooting or something like that when you're spending your time. In Hawaii, your activity patterns might differ a little bit from what I presented there, but learning a little bit about activity, you could kind of factor that in, what time of night you go out and concentrate your efforts. But yeah, I think if you have that much fluctuation in pressure and things, I think it's, especially from a trapping perspective and hauling nets in there or something like that, finding, getting it under their nose and being patient with them finding it. They will find it if, if they're moving through the area, even if they have small home ranges, they'll eventually find it. Um,
Right. Right. We have one here that just basically just offering up some information that they found effective, but it says here, it says, I've had success with blood meal and keeping the deer away.
yeah, we tried blood meal as well and had some success with that. Not as much as the liquid fence, from what I recall, but some success.
Yeah, I think a lot of these are regional. You'll find some things work far better in certain areas than others, and so I think it's one of those that wherever you're at, if you want to try something out, I don't know that I would do it at a trap site, but if you've got a bait sites or something of that nature that you can try and determine whether or not it works for you, then that's great. I mean, that's something that we recommend all the time is find out what works for you in your area. We can give you recommendation or thoughts, but exactly what's going to work for you in your given region, it's kind of a tough thing. So let's see. Well, the next one that comes in, and we've got a couple of more that's coming in. It says, what research questions are you most interested in answering relative to pigs? What are the big holes in the knowledge?
That's a loaded question. My interests are really anything we can learn about pigs that can improve the efficiency and efficacy of management. So my research, tends to be really applied, and so anything that we can do to help people who are out there in the field trapping pigs, managing pigs is something that I'm really excited about. A the list of needs is really tremendous. The study I mentioned on the reproduction, that's the first study that's ever been done on the known fate survival of pigs. There's probably been a white-tailed deer fawn survival study in every county of the U.S. at this point. There's been one study on pigs, but one of the things that I think we do need to know more about is how what drives sounder dynamics. And so for those of you who work in areas where sounders are kind of different, if entire sounders aren't removed, how that disruption of social groups changes their movements. How do sounders form? How do they dissolve? Like, we have very little information on kind of the social dynamics of pigs, and our management has shifted over the last several years for good reasons towards more of a whole sounder based approach, but we don't know very much about how these sounders form, dissolve, kind of break off from one another. And so, again, that's something that I think that I'm certainly interested in doing. I'm also trying to do a lot more work at the moment, looking at the effects of different management activities and how we can quantify our impact. And I'll give you a couple examples. One thing that we do a really poor job at is describing how effective our management is. If you talk to 10 different people who are trapping pigs or managing pigs on a landscape and ask them how their program's doing, they'll tell you how many pigs they killed 2 years ago and how many pigs they killed last year. But what they don't tell you is, what kind of impact did that have? And so we've been trying to do some work, and I like to expand this to really quantify those benefits. Like, how many dollars were saved in crop damage from that? How much of the population did you remove? You removed 100 pigs, but is that population higher than it was last year, or did you remove 80% of them? And now these are tangible things that you can go back to your stakeholders and demonstrate the impact that your management is having. That's what will help, I think, drive kind of the financial engine of pig management. If we can demonstrate that what we're doing on the landscape is having a real tangible impact on whatever it is we're concerned about, sea turtle nests, crop damage, you name it, wherever you live. If you can go back to people and say, look at what we did and look at how those resources were spent and what we got out of it, that's something that I think we need a lot more. I think we need a lot more partnerships between researchers and managers there. I don't think that's something that researchers can solve on their own. And the other thing that we're starting to do some more work in is kind of how to kind of fine tune some of the management approaches. So fine tune kind of where we're trapping, when we're trapping, helicopter work, for example, how to maximize the efficacy of those kind of tools. So all these, we have so many tools for trapping pigs. How do we optimize those for different conditions?
Right. We have one more here that's it says, would y'all present here on the deterrence for people not able to go to CFA? So I think that's something that definitely we can delve into the much deeper next month in December. I know that's a big question for everyone, pretty much ongoing. So we can definitely go into to deterrence for all the different species, some of the other strategies by season. So yeah, any of those specifics that specific species that you want to deter, geographic location where you're located at there, that could very well influence what you use for deterrence. The other thing is too, we got to think about what are the laws out there. Do you have any laws that are in place that's going to limit what you can and can't do with regard to deterrence? So and we will definitely address the old standby there where why don't we just use diesel? And so anyway, we'll talk, we can talk definitely in detail on that one. But Dr. Beasley, that's all the questions that's come in that I see here. And so we do definitely appreciate your knowledge, your insight, your willingness to join us today and present some outstanding information there, and then your insights and experiences just being in the field all the time. So let's see. Another one that just popped in real quick. It says, where are we with the contraceptives? Are there any possibilities of that in the future?
That is a question that I hear all the time, and I don't interact a lot with the folks that are working on that, but I can tell you kind of what I'm aware of peripherally. There's a couple of different avenues of contraceptives. There is a contraceptive that, to my knowledge, works in pigs. However, it requires you to physically inject that contraceptive into the pig, and maybe even annually. And so from a pig management perspective, that's never going to work. For pigs, it needs to be something that's can be remotely administered through bait or something like that. And there were some folks, I believe, in Louisiana who were working on, I think it's called a phage. It's more of a pig specific reproductive inhibitor, and I've not heard anything from that group in probably a year or two now, so I'm not sure where they were at. I know it's a real challenge to try and get something that's only affects pigs and no other animal, and so I think that's a nut that's going to take quite some time to be cracked. So
If it can be
at
cracked.
least last I
Yeah.
heard, there were people. Yeah, there were people working on it. I imagine they still are, but I think that's probably a ways off at this point. And then, you know, even if one is demonstrated to be effective, it's going to have to go through the whole process of, dealing with the concerns of throwing out a reproductive inhibitor on the landscape and making sure that it doesn't get in waterways or other species. And so, yeah, the short answer is I think people are working on it, but I think it's a difficult one.
Right. Yeah, we have another one that's here. It says, what about toxicants? Is any hope there?
So there's a couple of different types of toxicants out there. So USDA is working on a sodium nitrate toxicant, and that toxicant has shown a lot of promise, but they've run into some roadblocks, as some of you might know, with kind of application, getting it through the approval process, kind of making sure there are no non-target mortalities. And so that one, I think is several years off before we've got anything in the US. Different countries have different rules. Australia is a bit different, kind of what's available there. In the US, that's not available. There's a warfarin-based toxicant, and we did some extensive work on that a few years ago and found that with the formulation at that time was not really effective for pigs. And so the folks that manufacture that kind of were going back and doing some other formulations and things like that. And I believe that is now available for some use in Texas and maybe Oklahoma, I think. But one of the challenges there is the cost of administering it. From what I understand, it's several $1,000s per sounder to remove them with a toxicant just because of all the pre-baiting you need to do and all those kind of things. And so, at that point, that's more expensive than putting up a trap. And so at this point, I think things are moving in that direction. I think kind of looking into the future, I think we will have those tools available, but in terms of a widespread toxicant, I think we're a ways down the road before something like that would happen. And even when it is available, from all the work that we did with the toxicant we evaluated, it would just be another tool in the toolkit, no different than the different tools that we have. I've not seen anything to suggest it will be a silver bullet. It'll just be, if one does become available, it's just another thing that people might be able to use to kind of augment, shooting or trapping or things like that.
Right. Yeah, here's a statement here that says hog stop is still available now. So if
Mhm.
you're familiar with that product. The last one here, I think, is are there any programs or areas that have been successful at removing pigs and keeping them gone?
Yeah, there are a few examples of some eradications. This is something that um, there weren't a lot of examples, but there's a growing number. So a couple of examples, and they differ. There's been some work off in some islands off the coast of California where they did some fencing, I believe, to eradicate pigs. There's an island, what's the name of it? St. Vincent, maybe, off the coast of Florida, where USDA eradicated pigs from that island. There's an island called Jahasi Island, where USDA eliminated pigs from there, and they haven't come back. Pinnacles National Monument is another one. That one was fenced, though. If you think about a lot of these examples, those are more island-based approaches or places where there's fenced. But that said, since the USDA national program was established, I think they've eradicated pigs, um, not necessarily just them, but other, collectively, pigs have been eradicated from, I think, 11 states, maybe 12, compared to when that program was initiated in 2014. Those are northern states like New York, kind of peripheral populations. But I think those speak to really the success that you can have when you're proactive and strategic about removing pigs. Again, those are lower density situations, but it does show some promise. We in my lab have a project on a barrier island off the coast of Georgia, and we've been working there um, for the last couple of years, and we've already eradicated about 80% of that population with just one person. So just one staff member who's doing it, and I'm a researcher, so that's we're also coupling in research with that, and so our plan, or kind of our vision is within the next couple of years, pigs will be gone from there. And so yes, there is hope. I think in places where they're entrenched, that's more difficult. It's going to take a lot more time, but I think collectively, if we're a little bit more strategic than we've been to this point, I think we can have some success even in places where they're entrenched. So if you, for example, in the southeastern US, they're like in the state of South Carolina where my office is, pigs are found in every county, but they're only in about 25% of the land area of South Carolina. And there's some counties that have very small pockets. So we can strategically go in and eradicate them from those individual counties and slowly drive them back. So that's an approach I think we can, collectively as a group take, rather than just try to be everywhere at once, think strategically about what our goals are. And if our goals are to kind of more systematically reduce populations, maybe we need to rethink kind of where we focus our efforts to kind of achieve those goals.
Right. Well, that's all the questions that are here. So what we'll do is we'll within the next, for all of you that are here now, within the next couple of weeks, we will wrap this up and get it out to you. The recording will come to you. Everyone registered, just like we do on the other webinars, is get that to you once we are able to go through it and get it in a format that's usable to deliver to you. But again, too, just as a reminder, December the 12th is the next webinar date. That's going to be 7 o'clock Central. And if you've got any questions you want us to cover in that webinar, you can bring them that night, and we'll answer them as you present the questions, or you can email them to us, and that way we know that we've got it on our list to cover when we get started. So if you want to email those questions, send them to marketing@pigbrig.com, and we'll definitely put them on the list to make sure that we cover. I know that it's something that's come up already about the deterrents and the repellents and things like that, so we'll make sure that that's on the list to discuss. But other than that, I think that's pretty much it for the event today. Again, Dr. Beasley, we do appreciate you greatly for sharing your information today. And with that, folks, we appreciate you taking time out of your day. So we'll give it back to you. Appreciate it. Have a good day, all.